So, welcome everyone to the third of our webinar series for the Savvy Caregiver with Pride study. I'm Joel Anderson. I'm a professor in the College of Nursing at the University of Tennessee, and I am the lead investigator for the Savvy Caregiver with Pride study, which is funded by the RRF Foundation for Aging. If you are interested in the Savvy Caregiver with Pride study, we are still recruiting participants, and I can share more information about that at the end, but please send us an email at savvy@utk.edu. We'll be happy to share some more information. And this webinar series is in collaboration with one of our community partners, for which I am a member of the board of directors, the Carolina Aging Alliance. And so today we're going to be talking about the state of LGBTQ aging, looking at some data from recent national studies from the National Alliance for Caregiving and SAGE. And I am joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Jace Flatt, who is an associate professor and director of the Center for Health Disparities at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And Jace and I have been working together and collaborating for almost 10 years, 9.5 years now. And I'm looking forward to our conversation this afternoon with you.
Thanks, Joel. I'm excited to be here.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here because who else am I going to have this conversation? Well, there are lots of people I could have this conversation with. I know some of them are online, like Sarah Bybee and others. But given that we've been doing this work together for so long, I think it's a natural progression of the work that we have been doing. And so I'm grateful for you making the time to be here.
Yeah.
And Dr. Flatt is also a co-investigator on the Savvy Caregiver with Pride study. So two of the studies that we're going to talk about today, again, are the Caregiving in the US study, 2025 data from the National Alliance for Caregiving, and the State of LGBT Aging study from SAGE that Dr. Flatt led. And please feel free to drop questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll go through those as we go along, or definitely save time at the end to answer those questions that you might have. And this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the YouTube channel for the Carolina Aging Alliance.
Nice.
So I wanted to start with the Caregiving in the US data set. This is a data set that Dr. Flatt and I have used previously for research to look at the state of aging, LGBTQ caregiving. We first analyzed these data and published data from the 2015 survey, which was the first year that they included sexual orientation in the survey. And so this is a survey that the National Alliance for Caregiving does every 5 years. And so the 2025 data just came out this summer. And in fact, last week, they released some additional data that looks at things on the state level. So I just wanted to give some high points before we delve into LGBTQ caregivers specifically. So one of the things that they have emphasized in this new report that they released is that the number of caregivers in the US, and this is caregivers of both children and older adults, though we'll be focusing mostly on older adults. The number of caregivers in the US has increased yet again. And there are 10 million more caregivers in the US since 2020 and 20 million more since 2015. And that equates to about 1 in 4 adults, because that's 63 million family caregivers in the US. So it's only gone up over the last several years. While the majority of those caregivers are still women, more men are taking on caregiving roles, and it's usually younger men who are taking on these caregiving roles. And one of the things that sometimes surprises individuals is how young caregivers are. Nearly half of caregivers are under the age of 50. And based on data from the 2020 survey, almost 10% of those caregivers are in their 20s. And so younger people are taking on caregiving roles more frequently, and that includes the LGBTQ population. We found in our previous work that LGBTQ caregivers are significantly younger than their heterosexual and cisgender peers. 29%, or nearly a third, are sandwich generation caregivers. And that makes sense if you think about that these caregivers are younger and they're taking on caregiving roles at a younger age. Then they're probably caring for older adults, maybe parents, maybe older relatives or neighbors, as well as children. 18% of these caregivers report having to manage a disability or living with a disability themselves. And just over a quarter, 27%, are caring for someone with dementia or cognitive impairment, which is of great interest to Dr. Flatt and myself. Most of these individuals are working age family caregivers. Again, not a surprise given that over half of the caregivers are under the age of 50. And so they're balancing a lot of responsibilities. They're also experiencing a negative financial impact. Almost half of them report some sort of negative financial impact or financial strain. And again, this is in line with data that we've seen before. 1 in 5 report that they can't afford basic needs like food and housing. And in addition to these financial stresses, there are also emotional and physical stresses. So 1 in 4 family caregivers feel alone. 4 out of 10 report emotional stress, and nearly a quarter find it difficult to care for their own health while taking care of the needs of others. But what does this look like for LGBTQ caregivers? So those are some overall statistics for overall caregivers. And one of the things that I appreciate about the National Alliance for Caregiving is that in addition to these great infographics that I was just showing you that they make available on their website for free, they also have specific infographics for various caregiving populations, including African American caregivers, younger caregivers, Asian American caregivers, and LGBTQ caregivers. So these data come from that specific infographic. And following the webinar, as always, we'll send a follow-up email with additional information about caregiving and the information that we talked about today. And we'll include links to and attach the infographics that we're showing you today. So when it comes to LGBTQ caregivers, these are the latest data, again, from 2025. 1 in 10 family caregivers identify as LGBTQ. 33%, so you'll see that's higher than the previous statistic that I showed you, find it difficult maintaining their own health. So that's 6% higher than overall caregivers. And 28% report that their health is fair or poor. And this is in line again with the data that we've seen in previous years where LGBTQ caregivers were reporting higher levels of emotional, financial, and physical strain compared with their cisgender heterosexual caregiving peers. 37% of LGBTQ caregivers are caring for someone with an emotional or mental health issue, and less often use any assistance while providing this care. So 24% are making use of paid help, while only 43% are making use of unpaid health or respite caregiver supports or community caregiver supports. Again, this is still in line with what we've seen previously from previous years of these data, as well as data that we've collected ourselves. And so in a study that we did and collected data in 2019 and 2020 before the pandemic began, where we looked specifically at LGBTQ caregivers of people living with dementia, we found that nearly half were not using, well, just about half were not making use of caregiver support services, respite services, community services. When we went back and looked at those data and brought in data about policy and equity and climate, political climate and ideology, what we found was that was being driven by where these caregivers lived. And so caregivers living in more conservative areas or with lower equity scores were not accessing these services and supports, while caregivers living in more liberal states or with higher equity scores were accessing these supports. And so I'm curious to see as they make more of these data available, if that is still the case, because one of the things that we found is that when we looked at these equity scores in 2019 and 2020, and then looked at them today in 2025, the scores that were higher equity, more liberal and more welcoming states got better, and those conservative and low equity states, their scores got worse. And so if it was difficult for these caregivers in 2019 and 2020, we imagine that it's more difficult for them now. Among LGBTQ caregivers in this national sample, 27% said they were unable to afford basic expenses. 44% had stopped saving money altogether, and 32% say that caregiving makes them feel alone.
Great.
So those are the data from the National Alliance for Caregiving study about caregiving, and we can definitely answer any other questions, but I really want to jump into the State of LGBTQ Aging study or SOLA study that Dr. Flatt led with SAGE, and I am happy to advance the slides for you, Jace, and I will turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much. And I'm ready I can't wait to discuss the national caregiving study too. I want to talk with you more about your thoughts on how things are shaping up with that compared to our past work. So I wanted to give a little context about SOLA, the State of LGBT Aging study. That is a name that SAGE came up with. And sort of how this came to fruition is back in, right, probably very early 2023, they put out a call for proposals for research teams to kind of apply to help them lead this survey. And I think what's really interesting in how we did this was really to bring in a community engaged approach. And so as we developed the survey, we were really thoughtful around the language. A lot of times I had to kind of be compromise around like, well, these are known scales or words that we use for sort of in research. And what was really important to Sage, though, was more around the community friendliness of the survey. So certain questions were changed, or we might have dropped scales. We thought about time and the extent and information, both what Sage wanted to know, but also what was most important in terms of service providers and others. So this survey, it took place between August 2023 to May 2024. But even prior to that, we were doing work around the development. I would say active recruitment actually didn't even start until more around October of 2023 when we first started piloting with some of Sage's known participants, sort of their volunteers that we knew would do the survey and give us a little feedback on the flow and how well it worked. And then we fully rolled it out by like November, but then that started like the holiday season, so engagement was a little lower. So that's why we continued through May of 2024. What's unique about this is we really leveraged Sage's affiliates. So they have sort of I think they might have changed the naming of it now on their website and call it like Sage Collab. But they have affiliates across the country in each of the states. And then other contexts, let's say, for instance, an LGBT senior program that's either not affiliated with an LGBT center or it's its own standalone. So I think, for instance, in Washington, D.C., there's Mary's House, which is a group that provides affordable housing to LGBTQ plus seniors. So that was a group that we would reach out to, email them, send flyers and materials with the hope that they would disseminate. But we were pretty happy with the reach that we had in terms of 47 states and getting to Puerto Rico and the DC region. So you can see we reached over 1,000 LGBTQ plus seniors that were age 50 and older. These, on average, their age was around 67 years. So next slide. So something that we were really thoughtful on is that we wanted to reach LGBTQ plus older adults who are traditionally not represented in a lot of our research. So even when we look at national data, whether it's health and retirement study, right, or we look at the behavioral risk factor surveillance system, it doesn't have a lot of representation in terms of our transgender and non-binary communities, thinking about racial ethnic minorities. Sage uses the term BIPOC. I have told them about it, but they're like, this is what our organization uses. So that's not a language I typically use. So we were talking about it in terms of people of color, but we were really focused on reaching minority communities. We also wanted to get those that were living in rural communities. A lot of the LGBT service providers often have a center in an urban setting. So we can think about, right, New York City or, for instance, Fenway and Boston as examples. And so we wanted to make sure we also reached people that weren't in those settings. One of the ways that we leveraged this was Sage has a program called like the Friendly Visitor Program, and they had a telephone version of the program where they were reaching LGBTQ plus seniors during the pandemic that were in more traditionally rural communities. And so that was a way that we were able to target that. We also wanted to get people living with a disability and also think about those from low income environments. So that's sort of a breakdown of who participated in the survey. Next slide. So we focused on some key areas. One of the first was thinking about how are providers meeting LGBTQ plus seniors' needs? And so here you sort of see this broader overall for participants, around 45% believe that their healthcare provider would benefit from some additional training in terms of meeting the needs of the LGBTQ plus community. And then what we show you here is a breakdown by those groups that we traditionally see are underserved. And so you can see the highest percentage was reported by those who were people of color, but we also see some higher, slightly higher rates when we think about transgender and non-binary people and those from rural and low income environments. So this was something we really think is important. And then we were able to capture some open-ended comments. And so this is one example we have on here about, right, a community member sharing about how care may not be appropriate or really affirming to transgender older adults. So next slide.
I'd just like to hop in and say that I
Yeah.
really love this aspect of this infographic and the way that you reported the data because you are not just, oh, here's the demographic breakdown, and then never referencing those underrepresented groups again. So I love that part. And I love the inclusion of these quotes because we often see the numbers, but you and I both know that it's the stories and the details behind those numbers that can actually help affect change. So just wanted to
Yeah.
give you a
Thank
shout
you.
out for all of that.
Yay. Thank you. So a next one we wanted, so something caveat to put on here is that we did this survey prior to the election, right? And so, right, in terms of the political climate, we expect that probably this doesn't represent how LGBTQ plus community members are feeling right now. But what we showed you here already, right, 4 out of 5 were reporting that they were really concerned about anti-LGBTQ plus policies and how it's impacting sort of their sense of safety and security. And we saw the greatest concerns, and I would believe that this is even more exacerbated right now, but for transgender and non-binary participants in terms of anti-LGBTQ plus policies. And so the quote, to give you an example of some of the things that participants were saying, right? They're really concerned about accessing long-term care, right? What if I need to go to assisted living? How would I navigate that if I have to hide who I am? So just highlights really um, the challenges that we're seeing, even prior to what we're seeing in our current socio-political environment. So next slide.
Well, before I forget,
Yeah.
because I might forget, one of the things that we highlight in the discussion of that article that we just published about the equity climate scores is how so much of the legislation and policy initiatives targeting our community really kicked off in 2020, 2021. And
Hmm.
so it's not surprising to me that 90% of the respondents are reporting this in 23, 24. And yeah, how could it not be 100% now?
Yeah, I had a study with a colleague. We did something similar to what you and I did, Joel, on the rate where we showed as the increase in transgender sports ban policies were happening across the country, we linked that to the mental health of the LGBTQ plus community.
Mhm.
So regardless if you were transgender or cisgender, right, you were reporting because of these policies, your mental health was not as good as it was prior. So really shows the impact of policy on broader health for our community.
Absolutely.
Another piece that we found is right around social isolation. I'll actually be presenting a talk about this at GSA next week. Not using this data, but I will be touching on this to reflect, right? But showing, right, one in two, so 50% saying that they felt isolated, left out, or a lack of companionship sometimes or more frequently. And this is a huge concern when we think about our underrepresented communities. So, right, communities maybe in rural communities where they cannot access LGBTQ plus centers or in-person spaces as much. And so we share, an example here in the quote where a participant is saying, right, I don't have a Pride Center in my town. I'm a single older man living with dementia, who does not mind living alone, but I would like some connection. I would like to get together with others, have companionship. And so this really highlights some of the concerns that we see for LGBTQ plus seniors. Financial security, we've already showed even from what Joel was presenting on for caregivers, right? Issues around economic security. And so we see for the LGBTQ plus seniors in our study, over 80% of them are concerned about their financial security. And then when we looked at some of the communities that are traditionally underrepresented, right, not surprising, but we see higher rates for our transgender non-binary community members, those living in rural communities, and those living with a disability. And so we share a quote here that reflects, right, sort of this piece around people talking about wealth and how, right, they're worried about having enough resources as they get older, as they need more care, as they need to navigate, maybe that is assisted living or other resources, in-home care support. How are they going to navigate this? They're not wealthy, and they're really worried in terms of that. Next slide. So we wanted to ask some questions. A lot of the survey focused on sort of the needs for the community in the future as they age. And so one of the areas was on long-term care. So, you know, most of the participants reported being very concerned about finding inclusive long-term care. And then, as we've just previously shared around the financial security concerns, over 90% of them were worried that they wouldn't be able to afford it even if they found long-term care. So these really unique pieces for LGBTQ plus seniors around whether the care they get is inclusive, but also can they even afford it? We asked a question for, around reliance on Social Security. We hear a lot right now, talks around cuts to Social Security, changes to eligibility, all of those pieces. A piece that we often find very important for LGBTQ plus people are those who are long-term survivors of HIV. When they often go from sort of their disability eligibility to then an age eligibility in terms of Social Security, they see a decrease in their monthly income. The eligibilities are much different. And so here we show, right, 75% of our low income participants, as well as those who are 66% who are living with a disability, they rely on Social Security as their primary source of income. And so this is an area that's going to be really important that we think of for our aging LGBTQ plus community members. Next slide. Our survey wanted to focus on aspects around discrimination. So we did use some of those. Joel, you've used it, I think, in your caregiving study that you
Yep.
have did a few years ago. So the measures that come from the Aging with Pride study, we use those same measures in this one. So we looked at everyday as well as lifetime discrimination. What we show here is for the lifetime discrimination, right? Nearly 40% of participants reported experiencing some form of discrimination and or violence in their lifetime. So just highlighting really the concerns for our LGBTQ plus older adults. And then when we looked at exposure to these types of discrimination, we see the highest rates among the transgender and non-binary community, as well as among people of color. And then we see also greater concerns when we think about those who are low income or living with a disability, as well as slightly higher rates for those living in rural communities. So just really highlights the impact of place, but also identity and how that shapes your exposure to discrimination over your lifetime. Um, we also highlighted when we looked at discrimination, and this was actually something I presented on at GSA last year. We had some of this preliminary data, but we showed that if you had experienced discrimination, you were also more likely to say that you were concerned about being able to access aging-related services, things like medical care, long-term care, and caregiving support. And so we pull a quote here to kind of highlight sort of the impact that, oh, this isn't a quote. I think this is just a point that the impact of discrimination on, LGBTQ plus elders' likelihood to access aging services. So this has a big tie to this in terms of their reluctance to seek out services when they need them. And we find this across many of our studies. Next slide. So medical care access is another area that really stood out in terms of community members being concerned that they could access medical care when they needed it. And when we look at the subgroups, we see that it's elevated when we think about identity. So transgender and non-binary, people of color, those living in rural communities. This could be based on geographic distance, but also, right, just your ability to access it. We did not see, overall it was lower for low income individuals, but that may be due to maybe access to Medicaid. But I don't believe we specifically asked about that. But we're hearing now even around threats around access to Medicaid for community members. So that will continue to be a major concern. Um, Rural participants, they were less likely than our overall sample, right, to have access to affirming services. So you see here a 38% versus 51%. And then we do pull a quote from a rural LGBTQ plus person living in a rural community, how they talk about just like living an hour and a half away from the nearest healthcare facility. And that means if they can't drive, they're not going to be able to access that. So there is not public transportation. If they can't stay in their own home, there are not accessible senior housing nearby. If they do have any aging services in their community, they're often not LGBTQ plus friendly, and they don't see any specific programming for them. So really the deficits of living in a rural community in terms of accessing long-term care stood out from our study. Next slide. Sage has been leading a lot around affordable housing. They have on their website, it's something I use all the time, that shows all the affordable housing across the United States that's inclusive for LGBTQ plus seniors. This is a major issue for many seniors in terms of, right, their concern about being able to maintain their housing. So over 70%. And then when we look at this in terms of identities, we see some of the greatest concerns for transgender and non-binary people, uh, racial ethnic minorities, and also those from low income backgrounds. We didn't see as much of a concern for rural communities. We don't necessarily know. We might think, is it that they own their property or have more affordable rent? We don't really know that, but we just saw that it wasn't higher when we think about some of the other groups. So next slide. We wanted to ask some questions around relationships in terms of sort of what we would see for the LGBTQ plus community. So about half reported being married or partnered. Um, we did see that it was much lower when we looked at low income individuals, so they were often more likely to be single. Only about 18% of them indicated that they were married or partnered. Um, we found also some trends in terms of a little bit lower when we looked at people of color and those living with a disability. And myself being married, right, am concerned about this in terms of marriage equality being overturned. But we heard about this from our participants, both in terms of will they be able to retire? Can they depend on some of the entitlements that people get with marriage equality? Next slide. We wanted to look at really aspects around caregiving, but also families. And so under a third reported providing care to someone living with a disability or needing help with an aging related concern. But in terms of their ability to um, provide care, many of them were worried about it. So nearly 80% reported concerns about providing caregiving to loved ones as they get older and their ability to do that. We were kind of surprised, right, in terms of some of our studies show even a lower number of people with children. So about 65%, or if we turn that around, right, it's like 35% had children. Um, so low income participants were less likely to have children, and with 72% indicating they don't have children. We point this out because when we think about caregiving, right, and access to care, often in a lot of the research that we show, reliance on a caregiver often is biological family. That's not the case often for LGBTQ plus community members, right? But for many older adults, they rely on their children for caregiving, and we know that that will not be the case for many of our LGBTQ plus older adults in our country. They will have to rely on chosen family, or if they have the ability to pay for caregiving, that's what they'll have to turn to. Next slide. All right.
So I threw this in there to sort of transition us into the next bit of data that you share, because it's very easy for us to focus only on the so-called negative aspects of
Mhm.
caregiving and aging. And it wasn't the data that you share is not all doom and gloom. So that's why this light is there.
Perfect. Light. Yes. So something is so funny is that I'll just share this caveat. When we pulled these results together, it was near the time, right, when we started seeing, we provide the analyses, and I think it was just coming after the election. And Sage actually didn't want us to put out the results right away because they were worried that they would come across as too positive. Um, right? We've been presenting all these deficits, but they really wanted me to focus on strengths. So there's a reason this has not been published in a peer-reviewed journal is Sage has been a little concerned that it paints the LGBTQ plus community as being better off, even though I've told them we try to focus on strengths a little more. Often when we do research, it's all deficit focused. And the reason we wanted to focus on strengths is this is some of the information we were going to be giving back to our participants who did our study. And we wanted to, give some positive and some encouragement of things that are going well. So something that really stood out and we asked around sort of like political activism. So advocacy, right? 43% of our LGBT older adults reported they were involved in advocacy, organizing, or involved in some type of mutual aid. And what we saw was it was higher for some of our underrepresented community members, right? So transgender and non-binary community members and people of color were reporting that they were even more involved in advocacy and mutual aid. And so we share a quote with you here, right? Talking about it just represents their involvement. I've been involved in marches. I speak up. I have been involved in our fight for equality, and they still want to be involved. And so this highlights something that we often don't leverage is the knowledge and the experience of our LGBTQ plus aging community members who have been fighting for our rights since the 70s. And so just really a unique piece in terms of who we reached and some of the viewpoints that we were able to get. Next slide. Volunteering. This is another area that stood out, right? So more than 60% have spent time volunteering with a religious organization, or I think it's also other organizations in the past 12 months. So just really showing a commitment to improving our communities. They also expressed, and I think this is something, an area for research to consider, and we're seeing a lot of work around intergenerational connections, but LGBTQ plus older adults, right, are reporting, right, that they have friendships or close relationships with other generations, as well as their continued, almost 80% want more. They want to form additional friendships. So this really reflects an area when we think about how do we intervene to address aspects like isolation and loneliness, could be to promote aspects around intergenerational connection. Next slide.
Well, just a shout out to the Carolina Aging Alliance. We've received grant funding to support our intergenerational lunches program and to expand that program to do what you were just describing, Jace, of helping to form and foster and support these relationships.
That's incredible. Yay. Support networks. So 72% said they can easily find someone to help them if they need it. And 84% reported they have someone to turn to if they need some advice about challenges that they're facing or handling problems with other people. So in here, a quote again tied to sort of this mutual aid, right? That community members want to create a good community of friends who can support each other. So this really is a quote that supports this focus on chosen family and building chosen family. Next slide. All right.
Well, that's a good segue and a reminder of the Savvy Caregiver with Pride study, which is to develop a culturally adapted version of the Savvy Caregiver intervention for our community. And so if you are interested in being part of that study, if you're a caregiver or know a caregiver, please send us an email, savvy@utk.edu, and there'll be information in the follow-up email that we'll share with you. So those are the end of the slides, and we have plenty of time for our discussion and to answer your questions. And so I know you said that you were looking forward to discussing the caregiving data, Jace. Was there something specific that you had in mind before we delve into things? Because I have
I
some thoughts
haven't,
as you were talking.
yeah, I haven't looked at it in detail. Where compared to, I'm thinking of like some of our past publications that
Mhm.
where we've analyzed it. How are we seeing that you sort of talked about a trend of caregiving increasing, but are we seeing, you know, for the LGBTQ plus community, do you think we're seeing greater challenges or is it about the same? Where are we
Um,
kind of?
so what has been released thus far
Hmm.
is their summaries.
Okay.
So the data are meant to be released next year. So that's when we,
Mm,
you and I and others can really delve into that. But
okay.
it seems like from what they've released so far, that it's all increasing. And some of those statistics that we saw compared with the overall caregiving population and then the LGBTQ caregivers, the deficits were higher.
Mm-hmm.
They did include this time. So one of the things that I appreciate about that survey is that it is national and it's representative. And as they get better at doing it, they're asking broader questions and more pointed questions. So as you were saying, we're
Mm,
always trying to balance as researchers, not overburdening people, but getting as much information and data as we can. And so previously, in the years that we had looked at the data, they had a measure for physical strain, emotional strain, and financial strain. For the
mm-hmm.
2025 data, they have expanded that to look at other aspects of caregiver well-being. So I'm curious to see
Mm,
how those data shake out. They
neat.
also have data for some of the states, not all of the states, but they recently, as of last week, put out data at the state level, which is something they've not done before. So that'll allow us to also sort of parse and see, as you were saying, place matters, where we live matters, and what impact does that have on those outcomes. So I'm really interested in delving into these data. But what we saw,
Yeah.
you and I saw in our analyses from the 2015 data versus the 2020 data, is that in some areas those deficits increased, but in some areas in terms of accessing digital health resources and making use of technology to support their caregiving journey, we found that LGBTQ caregivers were the ones who were sort of leading the way in that area. And we had seen previously also that despite deficits, the resiliency that's the hallmark of our community because of our historical context is there and has an influence on our outcomes.
Okay. And what was the sample size? Do we know what the sample size
I
was
would have
for
to
the?
go back and look at
Okay.
that, but
Mm.
in years past, it's been right around 7, 8,000 people. So
Oh, okay.
um,
That's good.
it's a
Wow. So
yeah, it's a fairly good sample
10%,
size.
if it's 10% is LGBTQ plus, that'll give us some, should give us some decent numbers in terms of that. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did they
So I'm
ask gender identity? Do we know if they asked?
that
Or
I
did
do
they
not know
just,
because they
because
haven't
usually
put
they
out
just ask, are you LGBTQ plus or not, right?
right. And I'm
Okay.
trying to remember. So last year at GSA, which you mentioned, which is the Gerontological Society of America conference, um, they did a workshop and I was part of a panel of discussants talking about using these data. And
Mm-hmm.
it happened the week, as you recall, GSA was the week after the
Yeah.
2024 election. And I made the
Mm-hmm.
point that these data, like the SOLA data and the National Alliance for Caregiving data, just became so much more valuable than they
Mm-hmm.
were before. And then cut to a few months later, and public data sets were being removed and
Mm-hmm.
alterations were being made. So has become, it was already a valuable data set. It's become even more valuable. So I'm
Yeah.
really, as soon as they have it out, I'm going to delve into it.
Amazing. All right. Exciting.
One of the things that I sort of made a mental note of was when you were talking about discrimination and lifetime discrimination and violence.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned, yes, that this is something that we've seen in our data, microaggressions being one of the strongest predictors of the things that the outcome measures that we've looked at. Again, I'm wondering about the current, how all of this has changed just in the last year um,
Mm-hmm.
to exacerbate that. And I was,
Or it's even the right, there's been these what we're hearing, I think of even people's access to gender affirming care and how our transgender elders are being treated, right? And we share like reluctance to seek out care, but now there's fears around a provider not giving people their gender affirming hormone therapies or
mhm,
not supporting them or what we're hearing from some seniors is right where their provider is telling them I can't provide care to you any longer.
mhm.
Um, and so I could see those even really shifting based on we don't have that in this past data, but I would assume those are going to be some major changes.
Absolutely. I mentioned that when we did that first study where we collected community data, it was right before COVID. So we collected the data and then COVID hit. And so we
Hmm.
know that that had a disproportionate impact on our community. So it seems like it's a trend of just as soon as we close data collection, there's a world event or a life event that has some impact on us, which again points to that environmental context and where we live and the policies and the ways in which those support and or don't support our health.
Hmm.
So the intergenerational piece, I was so glad to see that again in the infographic. And as I mentioned, that's something that Carolina Aging and other LGBTQ organizations and centers are doing. Can you talk more about what's happening in the Las Vegas area and the groups that you work with in that regard of supporting
Hmm.
that dialogue and that cross communication and support?
Yeah, I think we need more, right? I would say like it's definitely not where some other cities, like when I was in San Francisco, they would have regular kind of like intergenerational brunches or events or meetups.
Mhm,
What we're seeing in Las Vegas, we have it's a event I go to every year to volunteer is we have a LGBTQ plus like family Thanksgiving event. And for a while they did the youth and the senior events separately, but they've started doing them together now. So that's something that we have, right? It's just like one event a year. I don't know as much around other more purposeful activities that they're doing. I think we need more. Um, I could see this as almost a unique kind of like buddy program, or some mentoring program where there's, cross mentoring. We don't see a lot of that happening right now. Unfortunately, what I'm kind of seeing for our Las Vegas community is they're kind of in crisis mode, in terms of worries about federal cuts to our community clinic, concerns around some grants being terminated and how they'll sustain the program. And then obviously right now, the big focus is on food insecurity.
mhm,
So our LGBT center is doing a like a local every other Wednesday, they have a food pantry program where people can, it's like a drive-through program to pick up food.
mhm,
So we have that going on. I did just do a trunk or treat event, which was really fun at the LGBT Center. And in that, I did see a lot more involvement with seniors, but also youth, a lot of community members bringing their families to the event, but also the local neighborhood, which it is in an underserved community, also comes and attends the event. So there are programs, but I would say not as comparable to maybe some more urban, larger cities, what I've seen in the past.
mhm.
So,
Yeah, we're similarly here in North Carolina with Carolina Aging Alliance. Some of the same programs we've had programs in which sort of your admission was to bring food for the food pantry for the Triad Health Project, which supports our community,
mm,
and expanding the programs, particularly intergenerational things, and working closely with other existing LGBTQ facing organizations. Sometimes, for example, the center here in Winston-Salem is very much focused on adolescents and young people, rightfully so. And so,
hmm
how can we partner with them as an
mm,
organization that is supportive and focusing on older adults to help everybody understand the need for and the benefits of that intergenerational communication, which
yeah.
is something that um, we're seeing more of in general. So also in Winston-Salem, there's a relatively new, it opened a couple of years ago, intergenerational wellness center, community intergenerational wellness center that has
Mm,
really taken off in the last year or so in terms of getting lots of different community partners involved. But it took a while for people to understand what that meant, I think, because it was located next to the existing senior services building. everybody thought, well, this is just for older adults. And so it
Mm-hmm.
took a while for everybody to understand what intergenerational can mean and how it can be beneficial to everybody.
Yeah.
But I would agree with you that this is um, definitely the time. It was already the time for that. It's definitely the time
Yeah.
for that now. So one of the things that I noticed, you mentioned GSA, and you and I both have several presentations, and there are folks who have joined us today who have presentations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I noticed as I was going through the program and going through the website for GSA, um, it seems to me that over the past several years, GSA has been even more conscious of an equity focus and inclusion, and that seems to increase every year. Um, what are your thoughts on how we as individuals or as part of organizations can help move the work forward while we deal with policymakers and lawmakers um, making
Mm-hmm.
decisions?
Yeah. It's so right. It's something that I can give these recommendations, but I think we always have to put this in our own individual context in terms of like, if you need your job or you need
Right.
these financial things, it may not be safe for you to advocate or to push certain things. So it's important for us to think about that. But in terms of GSA, what excites me is just that um, there is more work in this space. I'm assuming there's more submissions happening on equity, on LGBTQ plus aging related topics, and I'm hoping that's why we're seeing more and more of it, is that more and more is being submitted. So this is becoming a space. Um, I wonder, with some of the many of our researchers rely on federal money to support this work. Right now, for many of us, fortunately, we've been able to get our federal funding back. Um, so hopefully that will allow for some of the work to be sustained. I think a broader way that we can commit to doing this is that maybe we bring it more to our community level. For a
Hmm.
lot of us, we've been doing national studies, right? Today we're sharing like SOLA and the National Caregiving Study. But for many of us, that may not be possible. And
Right.
so maybe that means your sample is going to be a lot smaller. You're going to have 50 people in your local community in the study, or it might need to be work that your students are leading, and
Hmm.
and that might have a much smaller kind of reach in terms of the number of people involved, but I think that there's still some really important knowledge that we can gain. So it's sort of this, I hate like recommending it. It's like, how can we do stuff with even less
Yeah.
resources? How can we get creative? Um, how can we do I think of projects, right, where I'm now moving more into sort of how can I think about more participatory methods that don't require the sample size, right? Where I could have 20 people in my study, but it's a more engaged study, and we're using whether that's like photo voice or another participatory approach to get at the meaning and purpose
Hmm.
of um, the phenomena we're studying. So that's one thought of how to do it.
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
I agree with that, and I'm thinking of all the statistics that you presented in terms of mutual aid and community, and how it was high, how high it was, and how it was higher even among the minoritized within the LGBTQ community. And I think that is a strength that we continue to build on in that mutual aid.
Mhm.
I know that is one that um, the organizations that we work with and the community engaged focus that we both have with our research programs and the way in which we've worked together and mentored and supported and co-mentored people. And so I think that that mutual aid approach works in research, it works in community, it works in everybody's daily life. And so I think that's a way in which we can advocate for ourselves with taking into account all those caveats that you mentioned in terms of uh, the complexities of doing those types of things in today's world. Looks like we might have a couple other questions. Um, there's a question about being connected to Open House in San Francisco, and you are, correct?
Yeah, I am. And I wonder if there's someone's name in here that I think might be at open house. I'm not sure. Uh,
Yep, it
oh, it
looks like
is
Sylvia
Sylvia.
Vargas
That
has
was, I
responded.
thought
Yep.
so. I was like, I think Sylvia's with open house. Yeah. So open house is incredible. Yeah, you see, I don't know if people can other people see the Q&A
Yep,
questions?
everyone
Oh,
can
okay,
see the
good.
Q&A.
So they'll be able to see those links that Sylvia shared.
Yep, and we can share
Um,
that in the follow-up email. So everyone who registered for this webinar, as well as any of our previous webinars, gets a follow-up email with all the information that we talked about, links, resources, etc. And to the point of the person who asked the question about open house, it is also recorded and then it's archived on the Carolina Aging Alliance YouTube channel. So that link will be included in that email as well. And then you are free to share that with colleges, universities, your network.
Yeah, definitely check out Open House. I mean, they also, project that I've been involved with them is they have the Open House Unlock Community Day program, or the participants call it Club 75. It is so incredible. It's one of the first co-designed LGBTQ plus adult day programs. Just really incredible. I am hoping it will be a model for the rest of the country in terms of how can we both think about affordable services, services that reach communities truly in need. And also it's representing sort of what we would think of as almost this pre-PACE. PACE's program, all-inclusive care for the elderly. And so we're thinking also of that of like, how can we really reach people prior to them being PACE eligible, but then potentially we know, right, with aging that people will experience aging decline at some point and may need more inclusive care. And so it's just a really incredible program. I love to see that Sylvia shared, right? They have an intergenerational program, and that's the one I'm thinking about, right? That's one of
Mhm.
the ones I was going to when I was living there. And so it's just a really incredible model. I think other cities across the country are also doing just really innovative work to connect our aging community with services, intergenerational programming, you name it. So I think that's another thing we could think about, right? We maybe, as researchers, haven't volunteered enough of our time to support our aging service providers to help them understand what's working well, how can we expand what they're doing, how can we strengthen it, what are those opportunities? And so partnering with our LGBT aging service providers is another way that we could really give back, but potentially also be able to continue aspects of our research career that we may not have funding to do, but we could still partner to do that work.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, I want to, oops, one more. Let me just make sure this is a question. Oh, it's kudos. So I want to share some kudos. Thank you, Jace, for joining me today in this conversation. It's
My
been
pleasure.
it continues to be my pleasure to work with you and count you as a colleague and friend. And this is our last webinar for this year, but never fear. 2026, we'll have one every quarter in February, May, August, and November. And in February, we'll be doing a webinar about generativity and intergenerational wellness and legacy making for our community.
Love it.
So you'll get information about that. And thanks to all the attendees. And I hope everyone has a great day and enjoys the rest of 2025. And thanks again, Jace, for being part of
Yeah.
all this.
When people are at GSA, I hope to see you there. Come say hi.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. Take care, everyone.
All right.